Hello, this is Darren Hudson at Texas Tech University. I'm in the Agricultural and Applied Economics department, and today I want to talk a little bit about understanding risk. It's something we deal with all the time, but also how it might be being used against you at this point. And I think it's important that we kind of understand a little bit about what risk is in this environment of COVID, and how that might be in the context of media and other activities that may be impacting the way we see risk. I just want you to know I'm not a random guy off the internet. We've written a book with colleagues on the irrational terrorist. I teach the economics of terrorism here at Texas Tech in the context of applied economics. And one of the chapters in that book was regarding sort of media and risk aversion, and how all of those things sort of combine up and impact the way we see things in this context, terrorism, but also in the broader world of risk, and in this case, today with COVID. So shout out to my colleagues, shameless plug for the book, but shout out to my colleagues, Ari Perliger, who's at UMass and an expert, a world-renowned expert in domestic terrorism, and particularly right-wing terrorism. Riley Post, who's a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Special Forces and is also an instructor at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and Zachary Homan, who is a colleague and friend here at Texas Tech, who is a social psychologist. And, we wanted to address a number of things, but one of them was risk. So what is risk? Risk is a word that is spread about quite a bit, and people talk about it. We have an intuitive idea about what risk is, but essentially it's just probability. It's a probability, in this case, of something bad happening. So we don't want a bad event or a bad event to happen. But to be risk, there must be different possible outcomes. If there's only one outcome, there's no risk. So, we need to have multiple possible outcomes. That seems dumb, but, a lot of people will think about, the probability or an outcome, the impact of an outcome that's certain. Well, outcomes must also, if we're going to have different outcomes, they also must be meaningfully different. So if there's two outcomes, two possible outcomes, but there's no real difference in those two outcomes, do we really care about that? And that's kind of one of the problems that a lot of people, I think, struggle with, is that a lot of outcomes are so close to one another, but yet we spend a lot of time worrying about the probability of one event versus another event, kind of thing. And so we end up with arguments about in this case, if COVID ends up looking like the flu in terms of probabilities, and we spent a lot of time arguing about something that has very similar potential probabilities and something that maybe has similar potential outcomes. We don't know. We don't have enough data at this point, and that's one of the issues that we'll talk about as we go forward. But keep this idea about what risk is. It's probability. And so, in math class, we're going to throw up a distribution. This is a probability distribution. This is a simple one, one that is known, around and easy to deal with. It's IQs. The normalized mean IQ is 100. And then we have a distribution around that 100. And the area underneath the curve is the probability that we're going to see. So, for example, you'll see between 85 and 100, we would expect about 34% of the population to fall in that range. Or you would have a 34% chance of having an IQ between 85 and 100 if we just drew somebody at random out of the population. Well, it's the tails that matter in bad events. We don't want things to happen. So we get out there in that far left, and what we see is that anything less than an IQ of 70, there's only about 2.3% chance that we would draw somebody at random out of the population that would have that level of IQ. Does it happen? Absolutely, it happens. You may observe, you may draw a random group, and you may get 2 or 3 people that have IQs below 70. Um, Odds are just odds. They are if we did this thousands and thousands of times, but oftentimes we're only drawing once or twice, and so we either see it or we don't. But this helps us understand about what the probability might be of observing that. And so a couple of things, we would ask the question: if we drew 2 people out of 5 that had an IQ below 70, one of the first questions we would ask is, are we actually drawing from a random population? Or are we drawing from a population that is more susceptible to having an IQ? So in the case of COVID, for example, we see very high mortality rates in elderly and comorbid individuals with other underlying conditions. And so the rest of the population actually has a very, very low risk of death. That population has a much higher risk of death. But if we were to draw at random out of there and then we observed a high death rate, we would assume that the disease has a high death rate. But that's without looking at the other characteristics of the population. So that's why it's so important to understand, there's multiple layers to this problem. And so it's not quite so simple as just doing, a division of a numerator and a denominator. So let's talk a little bit, since we kind of know what risk is, and we know that there's a probability distribution. We know that there is some objective risk of events happening. So what's the probability that a nuclear waste dump will leak? Or what is the probability that you might have a heart attack tomorrow? All of those are objective. There is a stated probability. We may not know what the value is. How many times do we observe nuclear waste dumps? So we don't have a lot of data that tells us, that 0.5% of the time does a nuclear waste dump actually leak. We don't know that with any objectivity. There's some methods with experts of trying to elicit ideas of what that is. But as we've seen through this COVID crisis, sometimes, the experts just aren't that good. They're dealing with uncertainty in the same way, and then we'll talk about some of their decision making as we go along here. So there's this thing called risk perceptions, right? And again, I'm going to throw some terrorism examples in here because of the class I teach. But in 2016, Chapman University did a survey of Americans, random sample, and about 38.5% of the survey respondents feared being a victim of a terrorist attack, slightly higher than even identity theft. But from 2002 to 2015, the lead up to this survey, there were only 346 casualties in the United States from a known terrorist attack, meaning that the probability of being a victim of a terrorist attack was that very, very, very small number, 0.00012%. Very, very small. Yet people had a very high perception of that. And we'll talk about why that might be the case in this section. And, if you just look at, as of April 30th, the number of confirmed cases in New York, we all know that's probably way understating the actual number of cases. But the number of confirmed cases, is only about a 1.5% chance that if you're in New York, you would have a confirmed case or be a confirmed case of COVID-19. So, again, that's a much higher number than, say, the terrorism attack, but it's still a very small number relative to the population of New York. What that tells us is we tend to overestimate tail risk. Tail risk being that low, that low probability of something potentially happening. So if you ask average Americans, a lot of Americans believe there's a very, very high rate of lung cancer associated with the smoking, but it's not so high. When you look at the actual rates of cancer from people who smoke, it's a small probability of acquiring lung cancer. It's a non-zero. It's important, but it is very, very unimportant. Very small. Airline crashes, same thing. Terrorism. These are all events that are very bad. but they're very small probability. What tends to happen, or what is happening psychologically, is people are confounding what we call the expected value. So the expected value is the consequences or the implications of an event times the probability of the event. So if you think about a COVID-19 type scenario, it's a low probability that you may get it, but if you get it and it's severe, it's severe. Or if we have a terrorist event, if you think about 9/11, it's a very, very low probability event, but when it does happen, it has huge consequences. So some people confound the idea of what may happen with the probability of it happening. And so we tend to overestimate that tail risk. Well, that leads us to something we call the precautionary principle. And what the precautionary principle is, strictly reading right off the slide, a strategy for approaching issues of potential harm when extensive scientific knowledge on the matter is lacking. So you can see in the COVID situation, when we entered in, especially in February and March, we just had so little evidence about what may happen. So the objective risk, we had so little evidence that policymakers just pursued what's called a safety first approach. They said, okay, well, if this plays out and there's a high probability of contracting it and there's a high probability of being hospitalized, this is going to cause massive deaths. It's going to cause an overloading of the medical system. And so what we're going to do is lock this thing down and try to stem the flow of the disease. We could spend all day talking about social networks and disease networks. Those are very cool topics, but it is important to realize that what the policymaker was doing was responding to an idea that they had or a new topic that they had no evidence for. Hindsight's always 20/20. We can go back and we can look at what's happened before. As we get new evidence, we can critique what the decisions that were being made. But the reality is that these decisions were being made essentially in a vacuum of information. As information has evolved, we start to see more debates and talks about what the proper approach should be. Now, one thing about events, though, and reactions to events is that the events themselves and the reactions to those events create psychological responses. It modifies our risk perceptions, and we modify our risk perceptions to some extent. So news about an adverse event, and when we hear about a plane crash, we tend to have an increased perception of future crashes. We tend to think about these, and so you see people start to shy away from this. We've seen this with COVID events, where the contact tracing has revealed, so and so was at this restaurant or this grocery store, and all of a sudden people will avoid that location because they now perceive the risk of acquiring the disease at that location as being higher. It may or may not be higher, probably is not. But our psyche is attempting to mitigate the risk exposure that we have. So it's changing our perceptions. Other things like background risk, unrelated risk of things that are happening. My example here is the foodborne illness impacts and our perceptions of the risk of GMOs. So we tend to confound these things. They don't have anything to do with it. So, for example, in the COVID case, if your risk, if your employment is at risk, or you have other things going on in the background that aren't necessarily related to you contracting this, you start to behave differently on the basis of your perceptions of the risk of that event. And then also personality types, whether we're intuitive thinkers or judgers. We use a Myers-Briggs assessment, and it has an impact on how well we predict low probability events and how we perceive them. There's another element, so perception of the actual risk that we see. So our idea of the objective risk is important. But the other uh, intuitive part of this is our risk tolerance. Given a set of risks, how do we normally react? And so there's three types. There's risk neutral, risk averse, and risk seeking. Risk neutral people, they're just paying attention at the expected outcome. Risk doesn't matter to them so much. A risk averse person is a person who prefers less risk to more, and they're willing to sacrifice some level of expected value, be it personal freedoms or even money, in an attempt to reduce the risk. Risk-seeking individuals prefer more risk to less. Now, you actually have to pay them to forego risk. These are the gamblers, that sort of thing. I don't want to belabor the point, but the idea here is that this curved line represents what we call diminishing marginal utility in wealth or expected outcome. So if you have a gamble that has two possible outcomes, say W0 and W1, we actually would prefer, a risk-averse individual would actually prefer the value CE, which is the certainty equivalent, to just the expected value of the gamble. And what they give up is this thing called a risk premium. You can think of it as your insurance premium. That is, in fact, what we're doing when we're not required by law to have insurance. We buy insurance to protect ourselves against an adverse event. So we're giving up today's income to avoid a future loss. And that risk premium is essentially what we call the trade-off of expected value for risk. And so don't get trapped into thinking of it as just insurance, although as economists, we think of any action to avoid risk as insurance, whether it's an actual insurance policy or not. But, just think of it as the trade-off that you're willing to make to avoid risk. Now, we know people also typically compartmentalize risk. We perceive risk and rewards differently, and that causes us to take risks differently. So if we look at skydiving and gambling, you may choose to engage in one and not the other. Why? Because your perceived risk for, say, skydiving may be, hey, this is very, very safe because they've got all the safety equipment and, I've got my instructor and all this sort of stuff. And so I feel comfortable. I don't feel like it's particularly risky. But playing blackjack, I know that the odds are stacked against me in terms of the house. So, we perceive risks differently. Sometimes we're correct, sometimes we're not, but we perceive them differently, and we can compartmentalize them. So the same person that may go skydiving will not walk into a casino, and it's perfectly rational. So one of the things that we look at is perceived threats and perceived anxiety. There's an event occurs and it takes us down two different pathways, either a threat pathway or an anxiety pathway. If we go down the threat pathway, that's sort of a fight or flight response. We see this as a real challenge to our existence, where anxiety, as you imagine, creates a sense of dread and fear. And it's those outcomes that we think drive our decision making in terms of this, and how then ultimately this is used against us. So if we go down the threat pathway, threat leads to anger, which leads us to reject non-group members, xenophobia in the terrorism sense, but it also causes us to react in a way that lowers our risk aversion. Anger increases desire for reciprocity. It reduces the level of risk aversion. But what does that mean? Okay, so in the terrorism sense, maybe we're willing to give up some civil liberties. We want national ID cards. We signed the Patriot Act that potentially violated constitutional rights. It led to desire for military intervention, things like that. So basically, politicians are fairly risk averse, but the political implication of doing nothing in the face of, say, a terrorism risk is pretty important to them. In the disease world, we don't know that this is the path that we're going to follow. Now, we can use threats to galvanize action. So, the threat of climate change, the threat of illegal drugs, the threat of illegal immigrants. All of these things are keywords. Threat, threat, threat is the keyword to try to motivate action on you to take action, reduce your level of risk aversion, and be willing to go do things that you weren't willing to do before, or allow your government to take action that it was not allowed to do before. Flip side of this is anxiety. If we increase anxiety, we can increase our risk aversion. So fear of travel, preppers, anti-vaxxers, people who have a fear that these things are going to result in bad outcomes, and they're way overestimating the tail risk because of this, and that leads to an increased level of risk aversion. Now, the irony is that the terrorists in our world, their goal is to create an anxiety response in you. They want you to do this. They want you to climb into your shell or retreat and view them, in a way that makes you afraid to engage. But ironically, this seems to be the path that we're following with disease. We're now in this phase where we're talking about reopening economies, and people are already saying, "Well, I'm not going out. I'm not going out till I'm told it's safe." Well, it's not safe. It's never going to be safe. There's always a risk of acquiring a disease. So, in order to stimulate a response in terms of being accepting of shelter in place and other types of strategies that the government has used, and perhaps rightly to stem the flow or to flatten the curve, as they say. But now, as the curve has been flattened, we will start seeing the implications of this behavior on people's responses to that. They've psychologically now been trained, at least some portion of the population. We've increased their anxiety level and we've increased their risk. So again, I'll leave you with these questions, and I think they're important. And I'm not providing an answer, but it's an interesting way to think about this problem. Whether it be terrorism or any risk problem. But, words used by health officials, do they generate a threat response or are they generating an anxiety response? And how do you think politicians respond? They're risk-averse individuals as well. So what do you think that their response will be? Now, a legitimate question, and I don't think my answer to this question is no. I don't think they're purposeful in trying to manipulate you into an anxiety response. I think it's just a product of the person that's delivering the message. So if an epidemiologist or health specialist is delivering a message, they're delivering a message that's largely scientifically based, not always, but at least largely scientifically based, something that they believe is dangerous. But they're transmitting their perception of the danger onto you. So I think it's a very interesting topic. There aren't any definitive answers, but it is one that I think we need to pay attention to going forward. But hopefully now you can rationalize and think a little bit about risk and what risk is and how it is used in ways that may not be in your best interest in many, many, many topics, not just coronavirus and not just terrorism. Anyway, hope everybody has a great day, and thanks for listening.